We've both beaten the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and as big fans of the series, we've both got a lot of thoughts. Here we are with another MLIG Mini. For those who are maybe unfamiliar, MLIG Mini is our unscripted casual conversation series, and with this one we're kind of trying something a little different. We're just talking about a game. We're not talking about hardware or a device that maybe you want to check out. This is something that if you all like this, maybe we can just talk about some games more often in minis. They might be newer releases. They might be older games that we're finally catching up on. Maybe something we replayed. Maybe it could even be like a book club where we'll let you know what the next game we're going to talk about is, and you can play it to be part of the conversation when we're ready to release this video. Who knows? But before we really get into the talk of Final Fantasy VII, we are not holding back on spoilers here. This is going to be a spoiler-filled discussion. If you have not played Remake, you might think, well, oh, hey, I know what happens in Final Fantasy VII, but I'll just say up front that the ending is interesting and is very spoilable, and we really can't talk about our feelings and thoughts about the game without discussing the ending at some point during this. And of course, the scenes in the game play out in different ways. As well, after both of us finished Final Fantasy VII Remake, we went back and replayed, just so it was fresh in our memories, the Midgar section of the original game, because Remake is just the first part of supposedly at least one or two or three more entries in this retelling of Final Fantasy VII, and it only focuses on the Midgar section, but it is greatly expanded because the original Midgar section, people think it's this really long part of the game, and it kind of is, but it's actually not that long. So, Coury, I know that when Final Fantasy VII came out in 1997, you were already kind of a RPG and Squaresoft fan, which is maybe not the common story that you hear of with people with Final Fantasy VII, where it was maybe their introduction to RPGs. So what was it like, kind of the hype leading up to it and your experience playing it for the first time?
Well, it came out in the second week of college for me. It was my first year of college, and I had already played Final Fantasy III and II, and I'd played all the Phantasy Star games at that point. I had played both the Lunar games on the Sega CD, so I was a pretty big Japanese RPG fan from early on. I bought a PlayStation just so I could play it. I bought the PlayStation the June before it. I bought it along with Wild Arms, but it was the release of Final Fantasy VII that was the thing that sold me on a PlayStation finally. It's not my number one favorite game in the series, but it is probably a close second or third at this point.
So for me, I was familiar with Final Fantasy 4 and 6, 2 and 3 as you call them, because one of my friends was big into RPGs. But I thought they looked really boring. I didn't understand, why do battles take place on another screen? Why do your characters swing their sword, but they don't actually contact the enemy? The enemies don't move. It was strange, but I found myself compelled by like the characters and the story and the music, but I didn't think I wanted to play these games myself. And after that friend moved away, he kept telling me like, oh, there's this game Chrono Trigger. I think you would really like it. I know it's an RPG. But I really think you would like it. And I bought Chrono Trigger, and, became hungrier and hungrier for RPGs. I went back and, it was a good time to be buying up Super Nintendo RPGs because it was the late 90s and they weren't, other than Chrono Trigger, most of them weren't that expensive yet. And eventually I did get a PlayStation, although I actually played through Final Fantasy VII before I had a PlayStation, because a friend in high school, we weren't particularly close, but we kind of bonded over Final Fantasy VII. And when he beat it, he brought his PlayStation unannounced the next day to school and said, here, you take this, you can hold on to it until you've beaten Final Fantasy VII. And that was just such an awesome experience. So even though it was not necessarily my introduction to RPGs, it was instrumental in turning me around to appreciating the genre. And now, I'm just a huge Final Fantasy fan. I like almost all of the games in the series. And even though it has been popular in the past decade or so, maybe you say like, oh, Final Fantasy VII wasn't really that good. I completely disagree with that. I think it's a phenomenal game, a phenomenal story there's good reason that people are so attached to it. It is a major adventure and event in the history of gaming.
Yeah, I would say so too.
So, Final Fantasy, traditionally, the series would just release one game after another, and it would be a new world, new characters, nothing in common. But Final Fantasy VII was so popular that they started releasing, they called it the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, where this world was revisited. And what are your feelings on some of those expanded Final Fantasy universe games, the ones that they call the compilation of Final Fantasy VII?
I really adored Advent Children. I think that a lot of people tend to not like it that much. I really enjoyed Crisis Core. It's been a while since I've played that, so there's a lot of specifics that I don't remember, but I specifically remember liking the ending a lot and the way that it told Zack's story and how the ending battle can basically goes on for as long as you can last. And it's impossible to win, but it just keeps on going.
Interestingly enough, Dirge of Cerberus is probably my favorite piece of the expanded Final Fantasy VII universe. Honestly, I don't remember a whole ton about the story in it. I don't think it's all that popular of a game. Crisis Core tends to be the more popular Final Fantasy VII spin-off game, but I remember just being really bored by it, and I don't know why. I'd like to go back and play it, but I just remember it not being nearly as fun as I expected it to be. Advent Children, I think it's okay. Obviously, a lot of people were clamoring for a Final Fantasy VII Remake. It really kicked off when they showed that PS3 tech demo way back.
Oh, the intro. I forgot about that.
And then Sony did this incredible E3 where it was just so memorable because there were three things that people had been just requesting for years and years that people started losing faith would ever happen. And that was Shenmue 3 was announced, The Last Guardian reemerged, and then there was this trailer showing Cloud and Barrett walking side by side. You could see, all you saw was like the gun arm and the Buster Sword. And it said, the promise has been made. And it's like, oh my gosh. And this was, I'm pretty sure it was 2015. So this was still in development for a long time. And
I probably was not one of the people that was clamoring for a remake. But it was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah, I would agree that I wasn't exactly clamoring for a remake. I think the gameplay holds up. And the overall structure of the story, even the typos in it don't really bother me all that much. But, hey, if you're going to give me a Final Fantasy VII Remake, I will be excited for it.
I think the wind was immediately taken out of my sails when I heard that it was going to be a multi-part release. I'm not a big fan of games being broken down like that, especially games that we already know. Going into it, we thought we already knew the entire story. Maybe like certain beats would be different, but in the overarching scheme of things, we knew where this was going to end up. Leading up to release, I was back and forth of whether or not I was excited or if I was just going to wait. And I'm glad that I played it day one, but it was not a fan of the idea of it being broken up like that. I'm still not.
I was always kind of a defender of the idea of it being broken up because I feel that Final Fantasy VII is so big and so expansive, and there's so much going on in the story that you cannot tell that story to the degree that we would expect from modern day Squaresoft, with the level of graphical fidelity and all the voice acting and everything that has to go into that. You could not tell that entire story with the budget and scope of one $60 game. Like they couldn't justify it. I mean, it would be such a massive project. So I was always a defender of that.
I guess it's important for us to state early on that we barely follow any of the media released for it. Maybe we'll watch a trailer here and there, but for the most part, we don't get ourselves hyped up where we need to like consume every piece of information. We will basically decide we're going to get it, and then we will play it when it comes out.
Yeah, it's much more fun to be surprised by the game itself. Well, for the opening of the game, it's dead on perfect. The music is perfect. I mean, it just brings such good feelings. The way that whole sequence plays out is a great balance of very familiar, but also somewhat fresh. Beyond the reactor explosion, you're kind of up on the plate of Midgar, and you get to see what the people outside the slums are like, which is not something you saw a whole lot of in the original. And it has a very modern day feel. I saw a lot of people criticize the look of the generic NPCs.
Right, I was one of them. Like their clothing did not match the world that they were in, and in doing so, it made the main characters. I understand they're supposed to look different. They're more detailed and everything, but they seem like the kind of people that if you saw them on the street, they'd be like, there's something up here. I mean, if we saw anybody else with a robot hand or anything that's like not like a normal hand, it would maybe be less obvious that there's somebody walking around that has like a Gatling gun for a hand, or like a giant sword on their back. But I mean, like, I think that certain instances of that, and like that's no fault. I mean, that's just, they obviously had a random character generator that's just like putting these characters together.
Yeah, it's like why are Shinra's security not just like all up on these guys that have these gigantic weapons? But I feel like the name Final Fantasy works better with 7 and even like 6, 7, and 8 kind of as a group in a sense that they kind of have this blend of fantasy and technology. And Final Fantasy 7 and 8 in particular, I think, are supposed to almost feel like the real world. Technology is a little different. There's a lot of monsters and fantasy elements, but it is in a lot of ways based on a real world. In fact, early on in development, the game was supposed to take place in like the real world New York City, which obviously is an idea they reused for Spirits Within. It would have been a horrible idea, but they're clearly going for a modern but fantasy sort of aesthetic, and I think it's okay for people to be wearing suits and normal clothes, because the original game has lots of people just wearing very real world looking suits, and the people who live up on that plate, that is how they're dressed. They're dressed like a modern city. But I think it's okay for the detail on the characters to be fairly low, because I was really surprised by how populated the world was. There are people everywhere, and you get to see the aftermath of this explosion, be like, ooh, geez, like this was kind of a bad thing. Like this bombing on the reactor, like there's a lot of damage, a lot of people's lives are upended here. Like, you kind of have some mixed feelings about it. And I really appreciated, and this continues as you go down into the slums, which are extremely expansive, and there's a ton of people down there. You kind of walk by people and you overhear them talking. As opposed to you having to like manually walk up to each person and hit the button and see, and they turn around and talk to you.
What the? That's where I work.
No freaking way. Put that fire out, idiots.
I was there yesterday.
Something I've appreciated, that even going back maybe even as far as like Final Fantasy 12, and especially with 13 was heavily criticized for not really having towns and people to talk to and stuff. I've always felt that talking to people in a Japanese RPG is usually not that fun. So oftentimes in Western RPGs, character building and relationship building and stuff is much more a part of the gameplay. The Persona series really leans into that as well. But in just your typical, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, whatever, unless it's a game like, especially like a lot earlier, like more like 8-bit RPGs where talking to people gives you like legitimate information about like, oh, there's this cave to the north, and if you run into this enemy, I hear they don't like ice or something like that. Over time, I feel it became much more like just very, oh gee, I hope my turnips turn out okay, very incidental dialogue that doesn't mean much. And it just becomes this chore that you talk to someone, they say something. Well, I gotta talk to them again because in some games, NPCs say 2 things. And if they say something different that time, oh, I gotta talk to them again to make sure they only say 2 new things and not 3 new things. And then if they say a 3rd new thing, and then it goes on and on.
And sometimes those will trigger the next event to happen.
Yeah, so I really appreciated how Final Fantasy XIII maybe scaled back on that too much. Final Fantasy XII was very good at populating its world with NPCs you can't talk to, and you actually see like a little word bubble above the ones that, oh, I can talk to them. Final Fantasy VII Remake goes even farther in having very few NPCs that you actually directly interact with, but you hear people. Almost every group of people or individual person that you pass like sort of says something. They're having a conversation with another person, and it adds to the sort of the reality of this world in a way that I really appreciated, but did not add to any sort of gameplay tedium.
But sometimes, if you're like running through town, you're gonna have this list of like things that people are saying as you run by it, and it just like shoots up the side of the screen, and you're not even really listening or looking at what people are saying at that point. It would have been a little bit different if there was actually like a log that you could go through and read what people were saying, because once it's off screen, then it's gone anyways.
Yes, and that's actually a major problem that comes into play with the battle system. Because there's like a little sort of battle log, like after you defeat a group of enemies, it'll say like, oh, you got this much experience, you got this much AP, this much gil, you got these items, and it goes, and it's gone in like 2 seconds. And that especially becomes problematic with side quests, because the game has this kind of nice side quest interface where you go to the map and you hit the R2 button and you can see what side quests are either in this chapter. But then there's no like record of what did I even get from this side quest. Like 90% of the time, I had no idea what the reward was because it disappeared from a blink and you miss it battle log, or the character gave me something and it appeared on the side of the screen, but I was paying attention to what they were saying, not what they gave me, and I have no idea what it was even all for.
But overall, the game itself is extremely good looking. It uses the the Unreal 4 engine.
There's a lot of good aspects to it, and also a lot of areas that kind of fall short.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the main place that falls short is in the texture loading, which is something that didn't seem that out of place or bad at first, but as the game goes on, there's a lot of low-res textures that the game is focusing on. Like the one I always come back to is a close-up on the side of like the Shinra helicopter, and it's like the Shinra logo on the side of a helicopter. And the game, like it starts with a cutscene starts right there, and it pulls out from that logo, and it's like super low resolution. And it seems like stuff like that would be prioritized to make sure that it doesn't look bad.
There were times I was convinced the textures weren't fully loading, but then I think that maybe no higher version exists.
Exactly,
and that doesn't exist in the version that shipped. So I'm hopeful that they do have higher res assets and that it'll load much better on next gen hardware. I thought the area that stood out to me the most in general was the Sector 5 slums, because a lot of that area is built with just huge junk piles. And that stuff is like real blurry if you really look at it. But clearly they put their focus into the character models, because the character models always look great. I mean, at least the major characters, and obviously NPCs don't look great, but the main characters, the main villains, they all look pretty great.
I mean, Tifa especially. It's like, I feel is like the star of the game.
Guys, come on. We gotta keep moving.
Coming.
I'll go first.
I feel like they nailed the tone of it. I mean, it was such a hard game to get right because it's inherently kind of goofy the way it's presented on the original PlayStation, but you don't necessarily think of it as goofy. I mean, but there's a strange juxtaposition of things that are very serious and kind of weird and out there. And I feel like they embraced like the video gaminess of it, like when the Sector 7 plate falls, which is like one of the most horrible things that happens in the entire Final Fantasy series. You know, there's this moment where, you know, Barrett and Tifa are kind of talking, and, you know, Barrett's saying, you know, never let go of this feeling, this anger that you feel. And he, like, you see like Barrett and Tifa's hands together, and like his hand is just like so comically huge compared to hers. But like at the same time, like they were able to make Barrett feel like this larger than life character that he was in the original and translate him into this. And he somehow does not feel, he feels very true to the original, but not out of place in the world. And somehow it just works, even as ridiculously huge as his whole proportions are.
The skyboxes in this game are incredible. And that was something I was nervous about going into this, because in the original, basically like Midgar is constantly cast in shadow. You don't really see the sky. It's just like dark all the time, dark and grimy. So I was like, is that gonna get really old after a while, playing a 40-hour game that's like all in these kind of environments? But the skyboxes did a really good job of, you know, you can see the plate above, but you can also see the sky to the sides. And throughout the events of the game, I liked seeing how they changed, because obviously when major plot points happen, you know, there's more of the sky that you can see.
It's got nighttime scenes and it's got daytime scenes, and thank goodness it doesn't have like a day-night cycle, because I'm kind of sick of those.
I agree.
It's scripted when it becomes day and night.
Then I invite you to ready your portable battle simulator.
It was apparent from early on that they were probably not going to do exactly the traditional battle system, which I think a lot of people were very nervous about, but I continued to be cautiously optimistic. I was a little nervous because I did not enjoy Final Fantasy XV's battle system,
me either.
which honestly, I feel like you can barely call it an RPG. And so a lot of people are like, oh, this is going to be just like Final Fantasy 15. And I was like, I don't think so. I think they're going to do better than that, because you could see even in some of the early footage, which I think was from a version of the game that was under development at another studio that was eventually scrapped, you could see that you could switch between characters and things like that. So I was still very cautiously optimistic. And then when it finally, this past E3 in 2019, they showed the battle system of the final, that would manifest in the final version of the game, which sort of surrounds you build up ATB charges by doing regular attacks, and then you hit a button and the action pauses, or basically pauses. It still moves like very, very slowly, but then you can choose to use attack abilities, spells, items, and that uses one ATB charge. And I thought, man, this is a great compromise in giving it sort of a tactical feel, and that sort of time to think about your next move, while still making it sort of visually exciting and action oriented. My feelings on the final battle system in practice throughout the whole game are maybe a little complicated or mixed. And I liked it. I appreciated it more and more as the game went on, as I had access to more characters. I thought it was the most fun when you had 3 party members. I thought it was more fun as you are able to equip more materia over the course of the game. I liked having a lot more materia. You can change which character you're directly controlling, and their ATB does fill up faster. I liked controlling Tifa the most, because I really liked sort of the feel of her attacks, and I also liked that you could use her abilities to increase her strength and also to increase the level of what kind of special move you do on enemies. And she could also increase the enemy's stagger percentage in a way that the other characters couldn't really do so much. So I had a lot of fun with Tifa. And staggering is kind of an interesting mechanic that seems to be maybe becoming a bit of a mainstay with the series, starting with 13, which I do think adds an interesting level of depth to the battle system, where you don't do that much damage on most enemies, especially bosses, just with regular attacks. Like, you kind of got to break through their defenses and get them in a vulnerable position. I think it's interesting, but it can make battles, especially boss battles, maybe drag on a little too long, but it is overall good. But I felt like it was so fast and chaotic that I would have preferred, I'm okay with it being sort of an action RPG hybrid battle system, but I would have preferred something with a bit more of a measured pace, something where I could really think about and feel the impact of every punch, every swing, every, round of bullets that Barrett fires. I mean, there's just numbers flying all over the screen. I miss the days of where, okay, I'm playing Final Fantasy and I see my character run out and go whoosh, and then I see the number pop up and it's like, whoa, I did 2,000 damage. That's pretty good. I never even saw the 2,000 damage in Final Fantasy VII Remake. There's so many numbers. Like, I don't know. I'm paying more attention to how their life meter goes down to determine whether I'm dealing damage quickly. Like, I don't really have a good sense of like, what is a good amount of damage to deal in this game, because the numbers are everywhere. I want to sort of savor each hit just a little more, rather than just this pure chaos.
A lot of people look at random battles and think, oh, I don't want to play those because they take forever. But in reality, the battle system in this takes way longer than than random battles do in the original. And there's so many more of them. It really struck me the amount of bosses that were just like regular enemies in the original, but had been made into bosses here.
Yeah.
And that's something I didn't notice until I replayed the Midgar section of the original. I really started to hate the fact that if you're not attacking, then your ATB is charging so slowly. And there's situations where you can't go in and attack because you're gonna die. It's your last character, and I spent many times just running around the entire outside of the area waiting for it to slowly build up so I could cast a healing spell. And when you cast a spell, there's always, your character builds up for it and then finally casts it. And that's one of my biggest complaints, is that in certain situations that'll happen, things are so chaotic and you can't even tell what's going on sometimes, and you go to cast a spell and you'll get hit out of nowhere and you'll get knocked out of the spell, but you'll also lose the ATB charge and the magic points. You can get screwed over so many times by that it becomes frustrating. And I had many times where that happened also, where you get hit out of your limit break, and that takes even longer to build up.
Okay, now I'm mad.
The other annoying thing for me was you're so focused on building the stagger meter for bosses. Most of them have sort of very particular or specific rules to how you can stagger them. And you're building up that meter and it's almost there, but then almost all the bosses in this game, probably all the bosses in the game, have different phases to the fight. And sometimes it just seems like you get that meter almost there, and then they change phases and their stagger meter resets. And that's so frustrating.
Or they will have just been staggered themselves, and you want to go in and really beat them down, and then it switches to the next phase of the fight, and you have to start all over again. At least let us beat on them until the stagger meter is completely run out, even if that delays the start of the next phase.
And stuff like that can be a strategy in a lot of other games where it's like, oh, I want to like blow all this stuff on the first phase because the next phase is tougher, and if they have less HP on the next phase, that's good. And they kind of took that tactic out, which I'm sure was intentional, but it doesn't feel right the way they implement it here. But it is in a lot of ways nice that the game is fairly challenging, because the original is known for being one of the easier, maybe the easiest Final Fantasy. It was extremely accessible, but it's, you know, it's not necessarily a game where you can completely, you know, shut off your brain and go on autopilot. You know, it has its moments of challenge.
And you had mentioned before that materia in this is good, but they took away the ability for, like, when you max out a materia in the original, a new one would be born. Besides, like, the basic attack materia, like the basic spells, it's pretty scarce.
Yeah, I mean, even stuff like the blue materia, which is your linking materia, that stuff just seems to not exist in a large quantity. You can't buy them at regular, like, vending machines like you can some other materia. And the blue materia, the linking materia, is some of the most interesting materia. I mean, the magnify materia, which in the original version was called all materia, I only ever found one through the whole game, and I mostly used it with cure spells. But it sure would have been nice if I could have also had another to use with protective spells or more attack spells or something like that. That was, I just feel like there was more flexibility in the original of interesting combinations that you could do with your materia.
Get ready. I was born ready.
Stay back! Barrier drone damaged. Overriding main cannon safety protocols. Coming!
Another thing that is excellent in this, the soundtrack, which here is so much like a film soundtrack. I think that the soundtrack, the disc release of the soundtrack is something like 8 discs or something like that. I mean, that's more than like the Lord of the Rings trilogy on CD is. The interesting thing about the music is that it doesn't just like repeat the same music over and over again. It'll repeat the same songs, but it'll be a different rendition of it.
I mean, the regular battle theme alone probably has like 30 to 50 permutations in the whole game. I mean, it's kind of crazy. But what I really like about it, I mean, when you compare it to a film soundtrack, I think it's appropriate in the sense that you never hear like well, you do sometimes hear like the same version play again, but it has so much variety. The themes come back in different ways all the time. But I think comparing it to a film score, I think a lot of people might say that in a derogatory way, where it's like, it was kind of forgettable. There wasn't anything that I really remembered. But all of the familiar tunes from the original, even some that maybe mostly you hear after the Midgar section, you'll hear a little bit of in this. And they're just remixed in such clever ways. The main composer is, I'm probably gonna butcher his name. I think it's Masahashi Hamazu, who is no stranger to the Final Fantasy series. He did the Final Fantasy XIII series soundtrack, which both of us love. I really came to love his sound in that series.
You okay?
Even though I may have mixed feelings on a lot of areas of this game, I think the greatest gift it has given us is the existence of this soundtrack, because I just want to do nothing but listen to it all the time now.
Hey,
That's really...
yeah. Corneo's got certain tastes.
It really has moments, the way that it's presented, and it accentuates the scene. You know, like the one I always think about is when you're escaping from the Shinra building, and Cloud comes down on the motorcycle, pulls some ridiculous moves as he flies through the air. And it's this really great build-up and rendition of the overarching theme of the game. It gets you really hyped up in a way that, like, usually only Final Fantasy games can do.
Yes, that's something you and I talk about a lot.
Yeah, as those hype-inducing Final Fantasy moments. My initial impressions, sitting down and playing it the day it came out, everything was immediately expanded upon in a way that I'm not sure that it needed to be. I really liked a lot of the character bits and the way that was expanded. The parts that were really drawn out just happened to be like the dungeons or the set pieces was so drawn out to the point where they were just stopped being fun after a while. After the bombing, you're chased through the streets of Midgar by the Shinra police, and that part it's like an hour and a half in the remake, and in the original, it's one screen.
And you have this choice to not even fight those Shinra soldiers in the original. You just jump off onto the train and boom, that's that.
Well, it's funny because you look at people that were really hard on Final Fantasy XIII for the hallway-esque presentation of it. It would be interesting to see the reception that Final Fantasy XIII might get after this.
This game made me kind of be like, man, I could go for a replay of Final Fantasy XIII. And full disclosure, both of us kind of like Final Fantasy XIII. I thought it was an interesting exercise and kind of streamlined the RPG experience, and I thought it had a very enjoyable battle system. This borrows kind of a lot from Final Fantasy XIII, and people generally seem to be as far as I've seen, generally into the gameplay of this game. You know, the dungeons in Final Fantasy XIII, I thought were maybe about 15, 30 minutes too long, and the same could be said of Final Fantasy VII Remake, maybe even a little more so.
Way more so, in my opinion. But, I mean, even having replayed the original, like this whole section of the game, the whole Midgar section of the game, in the original is basically like a tunnel. Like it sends you in a specific direction that you can't really deviate. You're just going from event to event to event. If you have Final Fantasy XIII on one end of the spectrum and you have Final Fantasy XV on the other end of the spectrum, you have hallways and open world on each side. I mean, I would much rather go for a story-focused hallway experience versus the open world.
I agree completely. And I would say Final Fantasy VII falls much closer to 13 than 15 in that regard.
That's the thing I was really worried about going into this when they were saying that they were expanding a 4-hour portion of the game, 4 or 5 hour portion of the original into a full-length game. But a lot of that just comes from just running through the same tunnels over and over and over again.
But there are also several other kind of episodes that are wholesale added to this game. The earliest one is when Jesse, who is a very minor character in the original, asks you to go up to the Sector 7 plate, visit her parents, and then you go steal some blasting agent from a Shinra facility. And Biggs and Wedge come with you. And there's it's kind of an early introduction of the motorcycle mini game that is obviously the climax of this game. And it's interesting, but they bring in this very Tetsuya Nomura designed new pretty boy soldier character with his long flowing hair. And he seems like he's going to be a thing. And
never shows up again.
He never shows up again. There's also this whole thing in that chapter where you meet sort of the main Avalanche cell, I guess.
Right.
Barrett is kind of like an offshoot cell of Avalanche. And that doesn't even come up again until the very end of the game in a very, very minor way. So early on in the game, they're introducing these elements that don't play out in a bigger way. And at first I was okay with these added segments. I mean, I thought it was kind of cool, getting a little more character development on Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, but it doesn't impact the plot. And it really sold me kind of on the strength of the original that almost nothing that was added. I mean, there's small details that augment what already happened in the original that are great, but these episodes that are just wholesale additions never felt like, oh, I'm so glad this was here because this enhanced how this or that played out. They just don't add that much to the overall experience. They couldn't integrate it in a way where they could even bring this like newly introduced soldier character who definitely seems like he's going to be a thing. Like he never comes, like it's very, I mean, not, I didn't think he seemed like that interesting of a character, but it's weird that they didn't follow up on so much of this stuff. One of the parts that stuck out to me the most in terms of just like, did this really need to take so much time, was the sewers. So after Don Corneo, I think most people probably used to say Don Corneo, but his name is Don Corneo.
Ladies?
He dumps Cloud, Tifa, and Aeris down into the sewers, and you fight a boss. It plays out exactly the same in the original and the remake. But then you've got this whole dungeon in the sewers, and it's okay. It's not as bad as it could be, but hey, it's still the sewers. I know you're no fan of sewer dungeons. But it takes a while. Then you get out of it and you go through the train graveyard, which is, pretty long and involved. There's 2 boss fights in it. There's like a sort of a storyline that about the train graveyard that happens during all that. Then you compare that to the original, and it just struck me so much. The sewers are 2 screens. The train graveyard is 2 screens. 2 screens. I really came to a newfound appreciation of it. And not only that, they added things where it's like, not only do you go to the sewers once, and it's really long, you go to the sewers twice. You have to go to the sewers a second time before you climb the wall to go up to the Shinra building.
Yep, and it's this whole section that gets so drawn out. The guy that you go to the sewers with gets something taken from him, and you have to chase after the thing that, like, the creature that stole it, and it just keeps on going and going and going.
Now, we did, when we had that sort of second encounter with Corneo, I thought that was actually a good addition, because he kind of dropped some information about Neo Midgar, which is kind of an important detail that I think is easy to forget, that Shinra is kind of not interested in Midgar anymore now that they've got Aeris back. I'm sorry, I will say Aeris till the day I die. But so that I thought that was an interesting addition, because Corneo does not appear until kind of a very forgettable, missable part way late in the original game. And I thought it was good to bring him back, because I think he's a very memorable villain, even though he ultimately plays a pretty small role in the original.
In many ways, Corneo is the most video gamey character in this game.
Yes. In a lot of ways, yes. I mean, he is so outlandishly unbelievable, and he just leans into it. Really, the whole wall market section was pretty radically reimagined, and I think both of us kind of agree that it was one of the better parts of the game. I mean, I thought Wall Market, it's much more of like a slummy Las Vegas party town. And the circumstances of all the steps that you have to do to get into Corneo's mansion are quite different, but so much of it plays out the same. And I think that's one of the scenes in the game that people were most eager to see in general anyway. And the way it's reimagined is so goofy in a lot of ways, especially the dance mini game. Like it made no sense, but it was also super hilarious.
It was a good prelude for what would follow, because the game kind of gets into like kind of a dark place after that. And I think that was their intent of making it very lighthearted, and really it does a lot for the 3 characters involved in that part too, especially Aerith. Like, she really benefits during that whole part. This is obviously greatly expanded in a way that is not always appropriate, but in the terms of story, I really like the expansion of the events. I just wish they weren't so long.
Yeah, I mean, when you start climbing up to the Shinra building, I mean, I still had a quarter of the game left. I was around 30 hours, and I was over 40 hours by the time I finished the Shinra building. It is interesting, though, that most of the main Shinra executives don't really get much showtime until the Shinra building. if any. I mean, there's a very quick scene with Scarlet before the Shinra building, and she plays a very, very minor role in the Midgar section of the game anyway. But like, I even though you never see Hojo until the Shinra building in the original, I was kind of surprised that they did not highlight Hojo in any way up until then. He is, in a lot of ways, one of the most important villains in the game that maybe people don't think about that much. I mean, he is a major, major character, and I feel like at the very least, Hojo should have been introduced a little earlier.
In this, they give like Heidegger a lot more to work with right before the reveal of the Airbuster.
Right, they did do it interestingly enough with Rude, because I forgot that Rude, you don't see Rude until near the end of the Shinra building segment in the original game, but they did a good job of establishing Rude early on.
Much like his portrayal in Advent Children, where he's like, in here, he's like kind of a good guy. And then they like spin it around and they make him be the one that blows up the plate or drops the plate. It makes more sense for it to be Reno like it was in the original, because like Reno, he doesn't want to kill these people, but he's more about just like, all right, I guess I'll do it.
Been thinking, was all that necessary?
Had we refused, someone else would have completed the task. We have spared that someone the burden of a guilty conscience. Perhaps that will ease yours.
Yeah. Nope.
There's a lot of things that were added in that take away the mystery of the original, specifically the appearance of Sephiroth like in the first hour of the game, which immediately annoyed me. I was like, why are they doing this? It's like they can't keep it in their pants long enough. They can't keep this character in their pants long enough. That they just people are expecting Sephiroth, and we gotta get him in there as quickly as we can. By the time you finish the game, you will know like there's a reason, I suppose, for that. In the original, you don't even see him. You don't even see him what he looks like until a Nibelheim flashback where he's in the fire, right? Is that the first time you actually see what he looks like? Because he's only talked about in the original up to that point.
When you leave Midgar and you go to Calm, Cloud recounts the Nibelheim story, and you see him like come into Nibelheim as a soldier, and he's, an okay guy. And then, over the course of that story, he completely loses it and burns down Nibelheim. I was not particularly annoyed by it at first, because it's like, duh, of course they're going to have Sephiroth be a part of it. When the last stuff that I watched around E3, I saw Sephiroth appearing, and I saw, sort of some strange, dark swirly stuff. I'm like, what is this? And I thought like, that's not in the original game, but I was open to it because I'm like, oh, that's probably like, something about how, Sephiroth gets around through like Genova cells or whatever. I mean, it's a little bit ambiguous, really, even in the original, like, this isn't the real Sephiroth. I mean, this has to do with Genova cells and Sephiroth clones using Genova cells and stuff like that. So, the Sephiroth that you are physically chasing isn't the real Sephiroth, because his body is in the northern crater. My theory was that they were going to tell the whole Nibelheim story and explain who Sephiroth is in this. But ultimately, they give you no information about Sephiroth to justify his appearance. And especially by the time I went and replayed the original section and saw that you don't even see what he looks like, period, I really came to appreciate how the original, you see Sephiroth's name, he was a great soldier, he was a war hero against Wutai, that Cloud and Tifa had some horrible episode in their past that revolves around Sephiroth, but you don't know much details. He's just this ominous name. And then when you get up to the top of the Shinra building, and President Shinra is just dead. He's got the sword stuck in his back. The guy who had been the main villain of the game up to this point in the original, like, he is made to look real small by this big bad by just being killed off screen. And the only person that even saw him was Palmer, which was something that they did keep in the remake, although presented in a little bit of a different context and order.
Well, he saw him kill President Shinra in the original, and then here it's like he just sees him walking down the hallway.
In the remake, you see so much of him with no understanding of who he is, what he's doing, or why, to where I feel like if I was playing this story for the first time, I would feel sick of seeing this enigmatic character that I don't understand his motivations. I don't understand what he's done, where he's come from. I feel like it's so much more effective saving that story for after they leave Midgar, after Sephiroth has made his big statement killing President Shinra and then stealing Jenova and leaving.
It's like having Jabba the Hutt in Star Wars, where Jabba the Hutt didn't need to be in A New Hope. Being put into A New Hope takes away from his appearance in Return of the Jedi.
So, sure, things play out in little different ways throughout the game, but you see these ghosts, these brown ghosts. I saw them in the trailer, but I didn't quite understand what they were. Now I see that they are this clearly ghost shape. And they appear periodically throughout the game. And at first you think it's this malevolent force, and then you start thinking, oh, maybe they're actually kind of good. They seem to be guiding us to the correct path.
We were getting ready to set out when those things showed up and came after us.
The others?
Barrett and Jesse are holding their ground, but for how long? I don't know.
Throughout the game, just like in the original, Cloud sort of has these moments where he's like, oh, something's going on in his head, and we know that this has something to do with him combining his own memories with Zack, and also memories of Nibelheim and Sephiroth and stuff like that coming back, and also Sephiroth and Jenova, the Jenova cells control over him to make him do certain things. But in addition to that, something that was very strange that wasn't in the original was you saw a few premonitions when Cloud was having those episodes. You saw Eris's holy materia fall after she is killed in the original game. You see the Sephiroth clones marching northward for the Jenova reunion. And there were no premonitions or anything like that in the original game. And I was talking about this to you, and you had this theory about these ghosts that seem to be guiding you and these premonitions. And your conclusion was, it makes sense if this has already happened, right?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the whole game was going to be framed in a way that was Cloud's memory being put back together after he fell into the life stream, where they pull him out and he's just kind of like a vegetable in a wheelchair for a portion of the game. They would allow us to have more of a ground level look at everything from his point of view, and we could elaborate on certain aspects, and it would be okay if they didn't exactly play out that way. And it would allow this game to augment the story of the original versus just taking its place. There's nothing throughout until the very end that went against that. Like it would have worked all the way up to the end if the ending didn't play out the way that it did.
But just as in any time I play an RPG and I come up with this theory about where the story is going that seems too perfect to not be true, it's not true. So what actually happens, what's weird is that these whispers, they're called whispers. You find out very late in the game that they're called whispers. And they are kind of like agents of fate, which fate and destiny and stuff like that was never a theme or a concept in the original, as far as I remember, and in general, not something that comes up in Final Fantasy much.
And at this point in time is like extremely overdone in RPGs, I feel like. Like breaking free of destiny It's
Yeah.
like we won't resign to this fate anymore.
So out of nowhere, these whispers, which appear sporadically throughout the game, they envelop the entire Shinra building. And, they are... I've stayed relatively far away from the conversation surrounding the game and the theories people have come up with, but I have seen it posited that these whispers are us. They are us and our expectations. We are forcing the narrative to continue on the path that we expect it and want it to. We are forcing these characters to do what we know that they do. But there's a problem with this, and that is that the whole thing is entirely too meta. It does not, just like the episodes that are added to the story, it doesn't add anything to support the story itself. It is something that takes place outside the story. There is no need for this if there is no expectation surrounding the game. It doesn't fit into the world. It doesn't support the character's story. It is a very conceited way to essentially say, like, we're going to break free of this story and do what we want. So ultimately what happens is the final battles of the game after the motorcycle chase is defeating this gigantic Kingdom Hearts looking embodiment of fate and making it so that the future will not proceed in the way that that you think that you know it to. And so it's essentially a very meta way to announce that whatever games follow this Final Fantasy VII story, all bets are off. It's possible that it could follow the original closer than we're imagining, but they did things like Biggs is still alive. Is Zack possibly alive? It's a little ambiguous. Like they sort of seem to almost imply that there was something going on there. Eris, who knows? She might live. Maybe they'll kill Tifa instead. Maybe they'll kill Kate Sith. I don't know. I mean, I am so thoroughly uninterested in the idea of a separate Final Fantasy VII canon. And look, they own it. They have the right to do what they want with it. But I feel like it's a big slap in the face to the people that really wanted this. They probably convinced themselves, oh, people want to be surprised. And sure, I want to be surprised in small ways that make sense, change how a scene plays out a little bit, update it a bit.
Which you were, like, up until, like, throughout the game. You were, like, it was exactly that way throughout the game.
They probably convinced people that, oh, this will be good for people. Like, they shouldn't have these expectations. But I think it's not fair. I mean, again, neither of us were the people that were like, oh, you got to remake Final Fantasy VII. And look, I get it. These people have worked on, a lot of these people have worked on Final Fantasy VII before. Like, it's probably not that creatively fulfilling to them as creative people and artists to revisit something you've already done. I get it. I understand. I don't want to remake RGB videos, even though people ask for it. But here's my simple response to it. This is what I've been saying. If you didn't want to remake Final Fantasy VII, you should have just made Final Fantasy 16. Like, if it's not creatively fulfilling to revisit these characters, this story, and do it the way that people would like to see it done, don't disrespect what they wanted, make Final Fantasy 16 instead. Or hand off the remake to a company like Blue Point Games, who their whole shtick is making remakes. Like, those people that work there find it to be creatively fulfilling to revisit something old and present it in a new way. Maybe Tetsuya Nomura and other key creative staff didn't see it that way, but
And not only that, but all these people who are playing this game for the first time, they're gonna be like, what is going on? And you're absolutely right. They should have just made something else or had somebody else do it who were excited. It's like they weren't excited about the idea. Or they decided to do this 3 years into development and they said, man, I'm just like, we are all so bored of working on this.
Which it's weird too, though, just like how respectfully, though, the rest of the game is presented. Like it changes a little bit here and there. It augments this and changes that, just little tiny things. But for the most part, like they went all in on making this a great reimagining of Final Fantasy VII that feels, to me, honestly, it feels more tonally accurate than any of the compilation stuff. It feels more tonally accurate than Advent Children, Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus. Like it feels like Final Fantasy VII should. They nailed the tone and they put all this work into doing that. And then it's just like, oh, but actually, we really don't want to remake Final Fantasy VII. I would love to see them just add a game mode where it doesn't end that way. Everything about the whispers that happens periodically through the game is cut out because the thing is, it is so inessential to the plot that no one is ever like, oh gosh, like I sure hope the whispers don't, or those weird ghosts don't come get us when we're, climbing all of this Sector 7 rubble and we're gonna fall off and die. Because I mean, no one talks about them. They augment nothing to the story itself.
They show up, you fight them, and then they're like, and everyone's like, oh, what happened? And then it's like, we're on to the next thing. Like, there's no more discussion about what they are.
The hell were those things? Some kind of, I don't know. Guess I shouldn't be surprised, though.
Now, I fully expected them to not just end it with the highway chase, because you just fight this, Shinra robot that chases you down the road. And it's so weird to me that like Barrett and everyone else is just like, yeah, let's go defy fate and blah, 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 blah. It's like, dude, you just busted out of the Shinra building. Like this seems like an unnecessary detour and you're going to waste time defying fate. Like just get out of the city and go on to Calm. The characters were weirdly on board with this just out of nowhere. I'm not happy about a separate Final Fantasy VII canon, but if you're going to do it anyway, like, why don't you make it so that the main villain is Jenova instead of Sephiroth, and then maybe we can learn more about Jenova at least.
And it happens like the last hour of the game. Like everything up until like that happened, when you go into the singularity, and we're like, oh, what's going on now? I have not played any of the Kingdom Hearts games, but I understand that this is very similar to what happens in those. He couldn't help himself, I guess, or he just got bored. Nomura got bored with redoing it, and he didn't want to do it anymore.
I don't know, but I gotta say, it was easier to get my thoughts in order after replaying the original game. It makes me feel like this game has not replaced the original. It has in a lot of ways elevated it. It has made it the true original canon, for one. It has made me appreciate its snappy pacing. It's made me appreciate the quick loading screens. I mean, it has no loading screens. I mean, it moves from screen to screen very quickly. It moves in and out of battle very quickly. The battles move quickly. I mean, I think even though I've never had a problem with random battles and things like that, I think there still was a tendency to think like, oh, the game could be faster. Well, boy, I've seen the game can be a lot slower too. So now I just feel like Final Fantasy VII, the existence of the remake has made Final Fantasy VII a better game, 2 decades later. It's not to say that the remake is bad. It has. But having had a few days of distance from beating it has helped me sort of step back and be like, okay, there's a lot I appreciate about it. I like seeing the new versions of the scenes. I like the new music. It did so much good, and I don't think the bad ending necessarily takes all of that away, but it does put a cloud, no pun intended, over the whole experience, and it puts a cloud over whatever we're going to get from here on. Because it's like, if I wanted a new story that was going to surprise me, I want to play Final Fantasy 16, not Final Fantasy VII, the alternate canon, the fan fiction canon, except it's not.
I don't really follow too much of what the fan feedback has been, so I'm not sure if this has been something that people have liked, or if it's been evenly split, or if it's been universally negative. I have no idea.
But it does not invalidate the original in any way. I mean, in fact, it makes it more, it basically says the original is now its own thing, and you can appreciate that on its own terms. For example, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII stuff, you definitely know that Meteor did not wipe out humanity. Now, if someone wants to interpret the original that is what happens in the ending, well, you can do that again. Now the original has been confirmed as like its own standalone thing. Maybe the compilation stuff happens after it. Maybe it happens after the remake. We don't know now. So I guess it does in some ways give you more free reign to disassociate the other Final Fantasy VII media that you may like or you may not like. You can now disassociate that from the original game and just appreciate the original game for what it is. Yeah, who knows? So, I mean, well, we've got the future of the series ahead of us, but I'm not excited about it. I will play it, but you know, maybe we'll do another video in 5 years or however long it takes, and maybe our impressions will be more positive than we think they will be right now. You know, I'm not writing off that like the first trailer for the next part like might completely blow me away and sell me on the whole thing, but let's just say they've got their work cut out for them to win me over.